Austria's opposition to revolutionary ideas and movements that swept across Europe from the late 18th century was rooted in the imperial ethos of the Habsburg dynasty. At the center of the Habsburg monarchy was a fear of instability, change, and loss of control. Austria, more than any other European power, was a bastion of conservatism, clinging tenaciously to the old order of monarchs, nobility, and clerical authority. For centuries, this centralized authority had allowed the Habsburg family to exert dominance over a vast and heterogeneous empire, but by the late 18th century, the winds of change were stirring across Europe. These winds threatened not just Austria's territorial integrity, but the very idea of divine monarchy and traditional power structures. Austria's conservative stance was already in place long before the French Revolution erupted in 1789. The monarchy of Emperor Joseph II had attempted to bring reforms in the 1770s and 1780s, but even these measures, intended to modernize the empire, had failed to align with revolutionary aspirations. Joseph's death in 1790 marked the end of any meaningful reform from the Habsburg court. His successor, Leopold II, quickly distanced himself from liberal reforms, wary of the radicalization in neighboring France. However, it was the events of 1789, with the storming of the Bastille and the subsequent spread of revolutionary fervor, that would crystallize Austria's role as the guardian of the old order in Europe. France's revolution was not just a domestic upheaval. It became a clarion call for other nations suffering under the yoke of absolutism. Austria, ruled at this time by Francis II, viewed the revolution as an existential threat. The success of the revolutionaries in France would serve as inspiration to other oppressed groups within the Habsburg Empire's vast, multi-ethnic domain. Austria's leadership was committed to ensuring that revolutionary ideas, particularly those advocating republicanism, equality, and liberty, did not infiltrate its borders. The subsequent Napoleonic Wars would see Austria as a key participant in a European-wide effort to stem the tide of revolution. From the outset, Austria resorted to brute force and repression to stifle any whiff of revolutionary zeal. The Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s saw Austria actively combat French revolutionary forces, but domestically, the state intensified its measures to root out dissidents. Those suspected of harboring liberal or republican sympathies were persecuted, their voices silenced through imprisonment, exile, or execution. Austria's secret police, established to root out any dissent, became infamous for its ruthlessness. But it wasn't just the state's crackdown that defined Austria's opposition to revolutionary movements. The Habsburg monarchy also relied heavily on the Catholic Church, which acted as a spiritual arm of the empire's conservative agenda. The Church preached obedience to the emperor as a God-given mandate, branding any challenge to the monarchy as heresy. The peasants, who formed the bulk of Austria's population, were taught that the emperor was their divine protector. This religious endorsement of the monarchy's absolutism was a powerful tool in suppressing revolutionary sentiment. As revolutionary ideals spread across Europe, Austria's internal diversity made it particularly vulnerable to upheaval. The empire was a mosaic of ethnicities: Hungarians, Italians, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, and more, each with its own grievances. While the Austrian heartland remained loyal to the monarchy, regions on the empire's periphery, particularly in Hungary, Lombardy, Venetia, and the Balkans, were more susceptible to the revolutionary message. Nationalism, in particular, became a rallying cry for many of these ethnic groups who sought independence from Austrian rule. Austria's response was unequivocal. Revolution would not be tolerated within the empire's borders. The 1830s and 1840s saw an increase in political repression as Austrian authorities worked to suppress nationalist and liberal movements. Metternich, the Austrian chancellor from 1821 to 1848, epitomized Austria's rigid conservatism. His system, which became known as the Metternich system, sought to maintain a balance of power in Europe while quashing any revolutionary movements, both at home and abroad. Metternich's policies relied on censorship, surveillance, and a vast network of informants to ensure that revolutionary ideas were smothered before they could take root. Newspapers and pamphlets critical of the government were banned, and public gatherings were closely monitored. Metternich's repressive measures, however, only managed to delay the inevitable. By the late 1840s, revolutionary fervor was sweeping across Europe, culminating in the tumultuous year of 1848. Austria, long thought to be immune from the revolution, was suddenly at the heart of a continent-wide upheaval. The revolutions of 1848 were a watershed moment in European history, and Austria found itself at the epicenter of the storm. Revolutionaries across the empire, whether Hungarian nationalists, Italian patriots, or German liberals, demanded greater autonomy, constitutional government, and an end to Habsburg absolutism. In Vienna, students and workers took to the streets, demanding an end to Metternich's system and greater political freedoms. Austria's response to the 1848 revolutions was brutal. The initial concessions granted by the monarchy, including Metternich's resignation, were temporary measures designed to placate the revolutionaries. Once the monarchy had regained control of its military forces, it launched a series of brutal crackdowns across the empire. In Vienna, imperial troops stormed the city, massacring civilians and executing revolutionaries. In Hungary, where the revolution had taken on a distinctly nationalist character, Austria's suppression was even more severe. Hungarian leaders were arrested and executed, while entire villages were razed to the ground in a scorched earth campaign designed to terrorize the population into submission. The brutality of Austria's response was not confined to Hungary. In Italy, where nationalist uprisings had broken out in Lombardy and Venice, the Habsburgs deployed their full military might to crush the revolution. Austrian troops laid siege to Venice, bombarding the city and starving its inhabitants into submission. The reprisals against Italian revolutionaries were equally ruthless, with public executions and mass imprisonments becoming commonplace. The empire's punitive measures were not merely intended to restore order. They were designed to send a clear message to all subject peoples: any challenge to Habsburg rule will be met with overwhelming force. Though the revolutions of 1848 were eventually quashed, the brutality of Austria's repression left deep scars across Europe. The Habsburg monarchy had succeeded in maintaining its grip on power, but the cost was immense. Tens of thousands of lives had been lost, entire communities destroyed, and the seeds of future conflict sown. The empire's reliance on force, rather than reform, would ultimately prove to be its undoing. In the aftermath of the revolutions, Austria doubled down on its conservative stance, implementing even stricter measures to prevent the resurgence of revolutionary sentiment. The police state expanded, with informants and spies embedded in every aspect of society. Freedom of speech and assembly were further curtailed, and the education system was co-opted by the state to instill loyalty to the monarchy. However, beneath the surface, the revolutionary ideals of 1848 had not been extinguished. Nationalism, in particular, continued to simmer in the empire's restive regions. The brutality of Austria's repression had only deepened the desire for independence among Hungary, Italy, and the Slavic populations of the Balkans. The Habsburg monarchy, once seen as a bulwark of stability, now found itself increasingly isolated and weakened. In the next part of this series, we will explore how Austria's brutal opposition to the revolutions of 1848 shaped its domestic and foreign policies in the years that followed, leading to a gradual erosion of Habsburg power. The empire's reliance on repression over reform would prove to be a fatal flaw as new revolutionary movements emerged in the late 19th century. The seeds of Austria's eventual downfall had been sown in the blood-soaked streets of 1848.